Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Fluent Path English. I'm James.
And I'm Emily. Thanks for tuning in. Today's lesson is actually connected to one of our previous episodes.
That's right. A few episodes ago, we talked about emergency situations and how to react in English. Well, today's dialogue takes that a step further and focuses on first aid training.
First aid? That sounds important. But what exactly is first aid, James?
Good question. First aid is the initial help given to someone who is injured or suddenly falls ill before professional medical help arrives. It includes basic techniques like stopping bleeding, performing CPR, and treating burns.
Exactly. In today's lesson, we're going to learn some vocabulary related to first aid and emergency response. Plus, the dialogue gives us a look at what it's like to take a first aid course.
Right. This is not only useful English, but also knowledge that can be incredibly helpful in real-life situations.
So now let's jump right in and listen to today's dialogue for the first time.
Hey Joe, where have you been these past few days?
I've been busy with a first aid course that I started about a week ago at the Red Cross.
Cool! I've always wanted to do something like that. Have you learned anything useful?
For sure. We learned how to apply pressure to stop bleeding, how to check for a pulse, and even how to apply CPR.
Have you treated any real emergencies?
Well, they took us along with some paramedics. There was this guy who fell off his motorcycle and suffered a concussion as well as a couple of compound fractures. His wounds were pretty serious, so they had to rush him to the hospital. It was intense.
I can imagine. I tend to faint when I see blood, so I think I won't be taking up a course like that anytime soon.
Whoa, that was pretty intense. Emily, what do you think?
Absolutely. First aid training sounds really useful, but also kind of overwhelming, especially if you're dealing with real emergencies.
Right. Learning how to perform CPR and treat injuries is super important, but I can understand why some people might hesitate.
Oh, for sure. Especially if you're someone who gets queasy around blood. But it's still such a valuable skill to have.
Definitely. Now, let's go over some key phrases and words from the dialogue to help our listeners understand them better.
All right, the first phrase we have is be busy with.
Be busy with.
Be busy with. This phrase means to be occupied or engaged with a particular task or activity. For example, she was busy with her homework all evening.
Right. And in the dialogue, Joe says, I've been busy with a first aid course, meaning he has been occupied with attending the class.
Exactly. Now the next term is apply pressure.
Apply pressure.
Apply pressure.
This means to press firmly on something, usually to stop bleeding. For example, if someone is bleeding, you should apply pressure to the injured part to stop the bleeding.
Great example. In the dialogue, Joe mentions that he learned how to apply pressure to stop bleeding.
Exactly. Now, moving on to the next term. Pulse.
Pulse.
Pulse. Pulse is the rhythmic beating of the heart that you can feel by touching certain parts of the body, like your wrist or neck. For example, the doctor checked his pulse to make sure his heart was beating properly.
That's right. In first aid, checking for a pulse helps determine if the heart is still pumping blood.
Exactly. Now let's move on to the next phrase. Suffer.
Suffer.
Suffer means to experience physical pain or mental distress. For example, he suffered from a severe headache after the accident. Or, she suffered from anxiety before her big presentation.
Right. In the dialogue, Joe says the accident victim suffered a concussion and fractures, meaning he experienced those injuries.
All right, now let's take a look at wound.
Wound.
Wound. A wound is a type of injury where the skin is cut, torn, or damaged. It's an open injury. In contrast, injury is a broader term that includes both external injuries like cuts and internal ones like a sprain or a concussion. For example, the soldier had a deep wound on his arm, which means his skin was broken, versus she suffered an injury while playing soccer, which could refer to something like a sprained ankle or a muscle strain.
That's a great distinction. And lastly, let's talk about faint.
Faint.
Faint means to temporarily lose consciousness, often suddenly, due to low blood pressure, shock, or heat. It's similar to pass out. For example, she fainted from the heat during the marathon.
Right. And in the dialogue, the speaker says, I tend to faint when I see blood, meaning they lose consciousness when they see blood.
Exactly. All right, let's listen to the dialogue again and hear these phrases in action.
Hey Joe, where have you been these past few days?
I've been busy with a first aid course that I started about a week ago at the Red Cross.
Cool! I've always wanted to do something like that. Have you learnt anything useful?
For sure. We learned how to apply pressure to stop bleeding, how to check for a pulse, and even how to apply CPR.
Have you treated any real emergencies?
Well, they took us along with some paramedics. There was this guy who fell off his motorcycle and suffered a concussion as well as a couple of compound fractures. His wounds were pretty serious, so they had to rush him to the hospital. It was intense.
I can imagine. I tend to faint when I see blood, so I think I won't be taking up a course like that anytime soon.
Listening to it again, I can really feel how intense first aid training can be.
Yeah, especially when Joe talks about seeing a real accident victim. Just hearing that makes me a little nervous.
Right? That must have been a shocking experience for a first aid trainee.
Yeah, and the Red Cross was mentioned in the dialogue. Many people might have heard of it, but James, can you explain exactly what it is?
Of course! The Red Cross is an international humanitarian organization that provides emergency assistance, disaster relief, and first aid training. It operates in many countries and plays a crucial role in helping people during crises, from natural disasters to medical emergencies.
That's right. And in the dialogue, Joe mentioned taking a first aid course at the Red Cross, which is a great place to learn life-saving skills.
Exactly. Hearing about real emergencies like that makes you realize how important it is to know what to do in those situations.
Absolutely. All right. In the second half of this lesson, we'll be explaining 3 important medical terms from today's dialogue.
Sounds good. First, we have paramedics.
Paramedics.
Paramedics are trained medical professionals who respond to emergencies and provide medical care before the patient reaches the hospital. For example, the paramedics arrived quickly and treated the injured man at the scene.
Exactly. They play a crucial role in emergency medical services.
All right, now on to the next term, concussion.
Concussion.
A concussion is a type of head injury that happens when someone hits their head hard. For example, he got a concussion after falling off his bike.
Right. And in the dialogue, Joe describes how a man fell off his motorcycle and suffered a concussion.
Exactly. And another important term is compound fracture.
Compound fracture.
Now let's break down compound fractures into 2 parts, compound and fractures.
Good idea. First, compound. In a medical context, compound means that the injury is open or exposed, often because the bone has broken through the skin. For example, a compound fracture requires immediate medical attention.
Right, and fractures simply means broken bones. For example, he was taken to the hospital with multiple fractures after the accident.
So when we put them together, compound fracture refers to a type of broken bone where the bone pierces through the skin. It's a serious injury that requires immediate medical attention.
That sounds painful. I can't even imagine seeing something like that. And in the dialogue, Joe mentions that the accident victim had compound fractures, which made the situation even more serious.
That's right. Now that we've explained these medical terms, let's listen to the dialogue one last time.
Hey Joe, where have you been these past few days?
I've been busy with a first aid course that I started about a week ago at the Red Cross.
Cool! I've always wanted to do something like that. Have you learnt anything useful?
For sure. I mean, we learned how to apply pressure to stop bleeding, how to check for a pulse, and even how to apply CPR.
Have you treated any real emergencies?
Well, they took us along with some paramedics. There was this guy who fell off his motorcycle and suffered a concussion as well as a couple of compound fractures. His wounds were pretty serious, so they had to rush him to the hospital. It was intense.
I can imagine. I tend to faint when I see blood, so I think I won't be taking up a course like that anytime soon.
That was a great lesson. First aid is such an important skill, and I'm glad we got to cover it today.
Definitely. And we hope our listeners learned some useful phrases related to first aid and emergency situations.
Absolutely. Remember, if you ever find yourself in an emergency, stay calm and do what you can to help while waiting for medical professionals.
And if you have the chance, taking a first aid course can be a great way to prepare yourself.
That's right. Well, that's it for today's episode.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back soon with another fun and educational episode.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.